everyone. Welcome to EWNET podcast episode 7. Today we have with us Samiha Abdulmelik, who has over 20 years experience and is a peacebuilding and gender practitioner. As you know, EWNET Researchers Network works to amplify women's voices in research, creates collaborative spaces, and builds capacity for women researchers in Ethiopia. I would like to welcome Semiha. Welcome.
Thank you, Dalaya. Good to be here.
Today we're going to take some time and to discuss about you, your career, and your contributions to the policy space of peace and security and gender, both in Ethiopia and Africa. So why don't you start with telling us how you came about to focus on the theme peace building and gender. So who is Samiha and what was your journey like?
Sure. So I think perhaps I've ended up where I have currently because of a number of childhood influences. So I think the first one was the TV and news was sacred in our home. And both my parents really were following world events. And so we got sucked into that as children as well. So I think growing up, I just had a very acute kind of understanding of what was happening in the world. The crisis, Iraq war, Gaza, these were all things that I grew up basically hearing about in the house all the time. And then my dad, who I suppose most people would call a feminist, really inspired my understanding of what positive masculinities could be and what being in really an egalitarian society looked like. So I think he really influenced the work I went on to do on gender. And then, as soon as I finished my studies, the first place I arrived at was in Sudan, Khartoum, 2005. The CPA had just been signed and there was a lot of euphoria. So I think at the very start of my career, being able to see what was then considered a very momentous milestone for Sudanese history paved my kind of love for working in these contexts, but also my hope for the continent in terms of where it should go.
Beautiful. So I understand that one of your initial engagements in peace and security is with the Women Peace and Security Agenda.
Yeah.
And it has come a long way now.
Yes, 25 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell me about how it started? What were the initial conversations when you were part of that process?
Yeah.
And what does it look like today from your view?
So, it's been 25 years, and I think even before I started working in the policy space on women, peace, and security, I think the first time I really understood what it meant very practically was when I worked in South Sudan. And I worked between Juba and Malakal, and part of the work I was doing was engaging with women on the ground, grassroots women, trying to understand what are some of their concerns. So I think that gave me a practical framing of what women, peace, and security meant. And so the agenda, I think, has really evolved from trying to understand the impact of conflict on women, but also the kind of agency they have in terms of bringing our societies out of conflict and towards a more peaceful one. And I think for a very long time, the focus was on peace processes, getting women in the room, right? It was about participation, it was about representation. But I think we're also seeing an evolution in the conflict landscape where we no longer have peace processes, right? If we look at the conflicts in DRC and Sudan, there are no viable peace processes. We have agreements that have basically been parachuted from outside. So I think there has been a lot of work done to prepare women to be part of peace processes. We have mediation networks. We have a lot of networks that are supporting capacity building for women. But I think we've come to a juncture where we have legislative and policy frameworks in place to domesticate women, peace, and security. So in a sense, we've addressed one level of change, which is very much at a legal policy level. But the two other levels of change, which I think are still of concern, are really about financing and resourcing, changes in institutional relationships. I mean, if you look at both at a national level, ministries of women across the board are the least resourced ministries. They're the ones with kind of the least political clout. And so it's been very difficult for the women peace and agenda to progress in that kind of environment. But there's also another level of change that I think is really critical that we haven't managed to achieve, which is behavioral change. And that's broad-based behavioral change, addressing social norms, patriarchy. And I think without addressing that last layer, it's going to be a real challenge to transform the landscape.
Yeah, I think you've touched on it a bit. I see that when you function in these spaces, you work closely with, traditionally male-dominated institutions.
Yeah.
We're talking about the military, the police. So, I mean, how do you translate this very important aspects of the women, peace and security agenda to, such ministries or to such spaces?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really difficult process, and so you have to use different approaches. One approach is to be very instrumental. So you're basically selling why women's participation in the security sector is important. And this, I believe, has been easier in the police than in the military, because the police have more of an interface with the public and with communities. So you can sell the idea that, look, from an operational perspective, if you're doing crowd control, you need to have women there to be able to address the needs of female civilians. It's been much more difficult, I think, with the military, just because the military is even more deeply patriarchal, securitized, but also because of the nature. There's a lot of pushback, some of the arguments around, well, women shouldn't be in combat roles. So you have to use different approaches, and where you have low-hanging fruits. Like I said, with the police, it's much easier. And then with the military, you start by looking at civilian roles in the military. And then hopefully when you get a critical mass of women in the institution, they can help change the culture as well.
Is there any way to ensure that this is not, just, checking the box, and there is, a genuine process of integrating, gender-sensitive approaches? And how has been the practice when you see it?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a risk in some contexts, but I think having leadership on board, if you have senior leaders of these institutions that are saying the right things, not just saying the right things, but doing the right things. For example, one of the key issues in security institutions are issues around sexual harassment, right? And how do you put in place measures to address sexual harassment? Now, when you have the top leadership saying there's a zero tolerance policy, when you get the message from the top, often what we've seen is that culture starts to shift slowly. So one key issue is having leadership on board. They have to talk the talk, they have to walk the walk. But also we found it's incredibly important to engage male champions, not just at the leadership level, but very much at even the lower levels. Because that's where a lot of the women will come into the institution. And so you have to work with men very much to identify who would be a champion, how can you shift, even understanding women's roles. Why is it useful to have them in these institutions as well?
I mean, so how has it, how has your experience been in working in cross-cultural issues, both with women and men, and how do you build that solidarity that is sustainable? That when you leave your post, the community has owned it. These institutions have owned it. How has been experienced then?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you always have to come into any institution, any context, being very humble. And not being prescriptive, right? I think it's also very important that what you're doing is trying to understand the context and the culture around you, and being able to work with those people to be able to push change. It's also being very understanding that different cultures approach issues of gender. So in this context, when I was in Iraq, there was a lot of pushback on the term gender itself. And so you have to adapt the ways in which you communicate the work that you want to do. There are contexts in which I've worked which are very conservative contexts or from contexts with Islamic backgrounds. So then you have to tap in. Well, I had to tap into my understanding of Islam to be able to engage with people in those contexts. But I think for me, key is always be humble and also understand that you have perspectives, you have possible support you could do, but you don't have the answers per se, and you have to work with those institutions to be able to come up with solutions.
Yeah, I understand that peace and security issues related to women is always competing with other interests. So you have political interest, humanitarian needs, and then of course the long-term issue of peace building.
Yeah.
How has your experience been in terms of making sure that no matter what, the issues of women remain at the center and they're owned by these institutions?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's very difficult because even for example, when you're working on security sector reform, the focus is always on the hard issues, right? Like it's about training, it's about equipment, it's about policy frameworks. And so a lot of these issues around women, peace and security or gender-responsive security sector reform are seen as soft issues. What I've found really helps is being able to show the linkages between the two, right? That women, peace and security is not just a soft issue. It's about national security interests. So a lot of the work we did in Iraq was even looking very much at a policy level. When you're doing security sector reform, women, peace and security is not a soft issue. It's at the heart of the kinds of reforms you want to do because you're trying to move from, let's say, a militarized state to one that's more people-centered, right? So understanding that even policy shifts like people-centeredness in security sector reform, that has to include women who are 50% of your population. So it's about linking the issues with something that resonates with policymakers. So I think this push towards people-centeredness really helps in terms of pushing forward the women, peace and security agenda.
Yeah. So what would you say is your most success story and your most challenging story throughout this journey?
Yeah. So I would start perhaps with a challenge, and I think it's often when for example, I go into a context that I think I understand is quite similar to my own. So if I go into a context where it's a society that's mostly Muslim or mostly conservative, right? I think the challenge has been I come into it thinking, I resonate with this, I understand, what's going on. And often you get pushback because you're coming with a set of assumptions. So I would say when I was in Nigeria, working in particular communities, I had to take a step back and say, okay, well, this approach isn't working. But I think in terms of successes, I would point to maybe the work we did in Somalia. And why that worked was we engaged not just with the government and the ministries of women to help them, but we brought on board civil society. So it was a collaborative effort between ministries of women, civil society, to push forward some of this work. And in a context where there was a lot of tension between government and civil society, but we were able to do that around one clear initiative, and that was to establish one-stop centers for women, which was kind of a comprehensive approach to women who were survivors of sexual violence or gender-based violence. And that was able to bring together both government and civil society because it was a common agenda. It took some work to get that together, but we were able to make it work. And so I would say that would be a positive example of how government and civil society can work together even in contexts which are difficult.
Yeah. I know that patriarchy is a cross-cutting issue in all this, and I would love to hear your take on that. So how has it been in your work when you're working with men on issues of gender, but also when you're working against the system that has been there for a long time and continues to flourish? And how has that battle been for you?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what I said at the start, which is that my father inspired a certain ideal of what I understood to be a positive approach to gender. And so I think when I left home and went out into the world and saw elements of patriarchy and had to deal with it, in school, in university, in the workplace, I think what that has meant, and again, a lot of the places I've worked in are majority male. The space is also, peace and security is heavily dominated by men. Is that one, you have to work perhaps twice as hard to be able to justify that you are competent, etc. So there's that added burden of what you have to prove. But then there's also having to push back against what you hear, maybe patriarchal language or attitudes towards you. And that could be from a colleague, it could be from someone quite senior. So I think having to navigate this can be also quite, it can lead to a degree of burnout, because it's a constant, having to deal with constant, even if it's subtle, attitudes, behaviors, words. But I think it's also important that while you're navigating this space, you're very clear about when you speak out. And that may be difficult depending on where you're situated in an organization, but particularly speaking out for people who are not able to do so. So it could be your young colleagues who've just come into the institution and may not be able to navigate the space like you do. So I think solidarity is important. Yeah.
I know that you've worked in, some of the most stressful post-conflict situations. So I know you've been in Somalia, you've been in Nigeria, you've been in, South Sudan and Sudan and Iraq at the same time. I mean, how does Samiha survive in a post-conflict situation? I mean, what are your, coping mechanisms? And, there's so much bravery in what you do. You pack up and go, you are there, you're delivering, and like you said, you're working twice as hard. So what's the story behind surviving in these kind of situations?
I mean, I have to say that you have to have a sense of adventure and slight risk-taking. But I've also been very blessed that everywhere I've gone, I've had, despite you have security protocols and it's difficult, you can't leave your compound or there's restrictions on movement. I've been quite blessed in terms of being able to, in Nigeria, be able to come, because I was able to move around, being able to connect with people from Nigeria. But I would say books, music would be my first go-tos. And I have at least 400 books on my Kindle. And I've only read about a fourth. And music, those to me. And in Somalia, fortunately in Mogadishu, we're able to walk to the beach. And so there's something about water therapy that's incredibly important. And then connections, making sure you're always connected with your friends and family. And I think it's very easy to do that. But I think it just takes a sense of being openness to experiences. And so I have to say I've loved all of my experiences. And I kind of take a little bit of everywhere I've been with me. And I can't even now I continue to follow Nigerian politics, Somali politics, and Iraqi politics because it's a part of who I am because I've been there, even if it's for a short while.
I think one of the most important discussions about being in, in policy making is impact, right? So, I know you've worked in this policy making space for quite some time. What are your, grand and, little measures of impact? How do you measure your impact? How do you know that, this very important policy that's made at the AU or in, in New York is when it's implemented, it's actually for the benefit of the community?
I mean, look, sometimes your big win is just getting language in a document. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's the win. And sometimes it's that you see a shift in practice within an institution that down the road has impact on the ground. But I think also what's been quite useful and from my experience has been that I've moved from policy making to on the ground work back to policy. So there's certain perspectives you bring with you when you have that kind of back and forth interaction. Because I think often policies are developed and they trickle down, but it's quite rare that you have that feedback loop from the ground back into policy making. So I think for me, one of the biggest wins is when that happens, right? Yeah.
Like if you'd give me an example of, for example, two contexts where, you know, it's a similar policy, but when it comes to, you know, implementation and impact, it was quite different, and how you, how you became about translating that. Yeah. Because I know that, you know, it's Resolution 1325, but it looks very different. Yeah. It looks very different in Somalia, Nigeria, and Iraq, I know. So what has been your role in sort of like interpreting that when it comes to, you know, practice on the ground?
So I think, for example, what's been really interesting to see in terms of how Nigeria approached the national action plans is that they regionalized and localized the plan. So you had a national framework, and then you had a framework at state level, and then very much at like a local level. And what that meant was that you had states that were more focused on, let's say, climate change issues as they relate to women. You had other states that looked at issues of violent extremism and what that meant for women as well. So our role really was to support very grassroots consultations to be able to formulate these action plans that are really grounded in local realities. Because I think one of the challenges is that the National Action Plan framework is often quite broad because you're trying to fit in, it's almost like the least common denominator, right, for a country. So I think what we did quite well in terms of what happened in Nigeria is to support state action plans and local action plans that were really localized, and some of these action plans were translated into local languages. They were also accessible to people with visual impairments, etc. So really making sure that the people who it was going to affect actually had access. We're both informing the document, but actually had access to it as well. So that, I think, in the Nigerian context, that's what worked incredibly well. I think in Iraq, what we tried to do was use, instead of, while we supported the broader national action plan, we thought, as in my particular role, it would be better if we engaged sectorally. And at the moment, the security sector was a big policy issue in Iraq. So we thought the entry point should be to have a security sector focused action plan, right? Because then you're going to get more tangible results, because it's a very specific policy area and you're going to have very specific action plans. So, you know, in terms of increasing the number of women in the police with a very clear timelines, very clear percentages. So I think in that context, instead of developing broad frameworks, we focused very much sectorally. And I think that also was a good and interesting approach. What happens next in terms of implementation, we'll see. But I think being able to kind of drill down to a sector was really good in terms of getting traction. Because the challenge had always been there was a lack of ownership when you have a very broad national action plan, because ministries didn't feel invested in that.
So how political is, you know, issues of peace and security? I mean, there is always a tendency to depoliticize issues of, you know, women in many countries. But we know that, you know, there are very important, you know, power structures that will be affected when these laws are enacted. And what has been your experience in terms of identifying those loopholes to actually push for impact on a continental level as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of some of the work that I did when I was with the Office of the Special Envoy was to kind of do a broad sweep of what's happening across the continent on women, peace and security. And so we convened not just ministries of women, but we also convened ministries of defense and other sectors, right? And this approach was very much so that the women, peace and security agenda doesn't get siloed as kind of this small policy issue, but something that's of broader interest. I mean, of course, there are wider issues of financing. And again, I mentioned earlier, ministries of women often get the least, if you look at budgets or ministry budgets and across contexts, most ministries of women are severely underfunded, right? So part of the change we want to see, and part of this is the change in resource flows. And we have to be able to advocate for greater resource flows to ministries of women. Yeah.
So who are the women fighting this? Who are the women on the ground, who are talking to, governments, who are talking to civil society, who inspire, people like you, who you look up to, so that we identify them, because they're the most important agency, and what are they doing, and what has inspired you about them?
I mean, look, I think one of my most recent inspirations is really the work of the Sudanese emergency relief rooms. And there are those that are led by women and young women, right? So women who are at the forefront of trying to, despite a lack of the international community, limited funding, security issues, these are women who are keeping the social fabric together by being able to mobilize, right? So I think that has been my recent inspiration, being able to see particularly young women, because I think in this space a lot of what we see often is very senior women who have decades of experience doing mediation, engaging on advocacy, etc. So I think we need to be able to also acknowledge the young women doing work under incredibly difficult circumstances. And what I find interesting about their work is that they don't silo the humanitarian work they're doing with the peace-building work. They're very agile in terms of being able to respond to the moment. So for me, the Sudanese, I mean, a lot of these young women actually came out of fighting for the political transition, and then went into a conflict where they had to pivot. So I would say, and I don't want to name names because I think it's a movement of young people in Sudan who are running the ERRs, and particularly the women-led ones, because they're also doing this in the context of very little financing. So and I think they've been nominated for various prizes. So just to say that for me, that's my recent inspiration. But more than that, I think for me, it's the everyday women on the ground that I meet, right? That are civil society actors who, again, are doing things. They're paying for projects out of pocket. They're doing this for the love of the work. And I met many in Somalia who, despite kind of the patriarchal society, are always on the front rows trying to mediate when there are clan conflicts, right? So, these are everyday women. These are everyday women doing work on the ground that I find inspirational. And then, of course, there are very prominent women, I guess, in the policy space who've come before us that I think are inspirational because they've navigated policy spaces where there were very few women to start with, and have paved the way for, okay, I no longer consider myself young, but, for people who've come after that. Yeah.
And how do you see the solidarity of women working on peace and security, across the continent, and what has been the challenges in terms of building solidarity among women?
Yeah. So, I think there are a number of networks of women doing work on women, peace and security. One of the challenges I've seen is that often they're regionally or linguistically based. So I think because of the diversity of the continent, you often have like francophone networks. You have what I would, like an anglophone network, or regionally based networks. But I think the solidarity has been incredibly good in many respects, but I think then you have the language barrier. You also have context barriers, right? And then you also have that often women get sucked into dealing with the here and now of the work that they're doing. So I think there needs to be a lot of work done to be able to have cross-regional engagements and solidarity. But recently I was talking to someone who is part of FemWise from the Nigeria chapter, and she was talking about how when the coup happened in Niger, Burkina, and Mali, they used their own money to kind of fly out to these countries to show their solidarity with women on the ground. So a lot of this is happening without support. and it's happening somewhat in an unstructured manner, but I think there is a lot of solidarity across the continent.
Yeah. So let me bring you back home to Ethiopia. How has the implementation of Women, Peace and Security Agenda and Resolution 1325 have been within the Ethiopian context?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Ethiopia didn't have a national action plan for a very long time. And I think there was a move to develop a national action plan and bring together different actors to develop a document. But I think also the challenge in the Ethiopian context has been that, and again, this is my opinion, that there hasn't been broad-based sensitization of Ethiopian publics on what women, peace and security agenda is about in the way that we've seen in other contexts. So I think the sensitization has been limited. I mean, within civil society circles, I think a lot of people understand what the agenda is, but public awareness of this agenda, I think, is quite low. So I think there's that. And then I think also there have been, there's a transitional justice process happening. There are a lot of policy issues that I think need to be engendered and that need to be captured as part of a broader agenda on women, peace and security for Ethiopia.
I mean, what does that tell us about these is important, like international frameworks?
Yeah.
And what do they really look like when they're actually implemented within countries? And maybe you can say a little bit why it was not implemented in Ethiopia before, and what is the new context that made us, think about it now? And I mean, what could be the mechanisms? Because I know that it's a very important agenda because we're going through a lot in Ethiopia as well. So how do you see this very important framework in reinforcing these very important issues of women, peace and security?
So, I mean, I think one thing that I've learned in the many years of working on women, peace and security is that a national action plan needs to have broad ownership and it needs to have high-level political will that backs it, right? So I think that's incredibly important. And then, so I think there's a question of whether those conditions are met. I think there's also another issue of, at this particular moment, what is the big... I mean, a challenge is that a national action plan can be so broad that it's meaningless in a way. So I think the challenge for Ethiopia will be how do we bring to the fore the big issues of the day. I mean, we've had a war in the north. There's a peace agreement. What does that mean around accountability issues? What does that mean around transitional justice? So I think there are a number of issues that come up, but I think it's also important to be forward-looking, right? What are the emerging issues that are coming up that are important to this agenda around climate change? It could be economic issues. So it's a kind of balance between being able to address the situation we've come out of, but also being very forward-looking. And again, as I said, you need to have political will, you need to have broad ownership, and you need to have a broader public that understands what this is about. If there's been anything we've learned is that you have to have massive, massive public sensitization, and it needs to be translated in a way they understand. I mean, I think if you translated women, peace and security into Amharic, people might say, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean practically? What are the issues we're looking at? So I think where the agenda has been successful is where you kind of hinge the agenda on very practical issues that people on the ground understand. So that's what I would say for where we are in Ethiopia currently, being able to look back, but also look forward in setting a very concrete agenda for women, peace and security.
I think what's really coming out is the importance of, I think, national governments and national ownership. So in a way, in your opinion, what instruments exist, say within the UN or the African Union to actually inspire these national governments, to take responsibility, to internalize this very important issue within their context. And I don't know, is there any example that comes at the top of your mind how somehow governments have learned to actually adopt this? And of course, not only adopting it, but it should be, broad-based, with various stakeholders.
So there are a number of processes. One is what the UN calls the national focal point system. So there are focal points within countries that regularly meet and share experiences. So countries that have, let's say, developed a first national action plan or decide to go about it a different way. So there's a kind of a collective platform of learning between member states based on this focal point system. I think that's really important in terms of exchanges and learnings, because what we're saying is not that there has to be a one-sized approach to, we're not saying we need to have a national action plan. It's just that we need to have a concrete plan for how we're going to address these issues. And so different countries have taken different approaches. So I think that platform is important. The African Union also has a continental results framework, which is kind of a regular monitoring of how women, peace and security is being implemented across the continent. And that also, again, allows countries to be both inspired, but also serve as a kind of baseline for them in terms of where they may be, in terms of how they're engaging on women, peace and security.
Do you think there is a difference when it's being led by women? Like by, like a women minister, because I know we're always debating about, the quantity and the quality of, women leadership. Yeah. So I also feel like there's huge pressure on, on women leaders to actually, take this forward.
Yeah.
So, what has been your observation, across the continent about women leadership and these very important issues, mostly on a national level?
Look, I think having women in leadership positions is incredibly important in and of itself, because I think it has a kind of being able to see women in those positions, I think, can serve as inspiration for younger people. But I think, again, what's even more important is what agenda these women come with. And sometimes, for example, I've been in contexts where the minister came from an NGO or CSO background and therefore had relationships with civil society and could draw on those relationships to be able to push the agenda forward. There have been contexts in which there was a woman in leadership who was willing but didn't have the resources or deeper understanding of how to go about this agenda. So, I think it's also important for us to be able to support women in leadership, right? Because they may be coming from different backgrounds. They may not have a gender background, but they may have an agenda they want to implement. So just to say, it's important to see women in leadership, and I think as of rights, women have a right to be in leadership. But to go even further, it's how do we support women in leadership to have an agenda that's women first, and also how do we, as whether it's civil society, academics, researchers, be able to build solidarity around an agenda.
What has been the experience of policymakers talking to academicians? Because one of the things that EWNET wants to do is to make sure that these two groups are connected. So, how often does a policymaker, go to a journal, open an article on, on peace building, and then, get some, empirical data.
Quite rare, unfortunately.
And, I guess vice versa as well. Is there a conversation? Because I know there's been a lot of important works that are, taking place academically on peace building, even on women and peace and security agenda itself, basically being done, I guess, for the policy implementers. But how often do these two groups speak?
I would have to say, in my personal experience and what I've seen, it's been more that academics have been more, have shown more initiative in terms of engaging policymakers than the other way around, unfortunately or fortunately. And I think that's partly because policymakers are kind of very busy and are working on, as a policymaker, you need to write a report and it's due today, right? You don't have the kind of timelines and the luxuries of an academic to be able to have, the time to kind of delve into issues. But I think what's also important are efforts to have I think policymakers need to write, but they often don't know how to write well. And so being able to bridge the two, bring them together is very important. And I think it needs to happen in a structured way. One of the things that we used to talk about is how do we put writing as part of your performance measures as policymakers, right? Because then it forces you to engage with academics, etc. But I would say policymakers tend to engage more with, let's say, think tank policy research than academic research, which is understandable because you don't have the time to digest something that's either too complex or too long. So I think there's a need to be able to... Academic research is incredibly important, but it also needs to translate into more digestible pieces. And I think the conversation... Policymakers need to show a lot more initiative in terms of engaging academics. Because from, like I said, what I've seen is more from the other side.
Maybe I want to hear a little bit about, policy, people in the policy space, having time, having not time to write. Maybe I understand, the daily urgency of actually, delivering something. Maybe you have to put it on the, on your boss's table, and it has to be like short, precise, and all that. How can we best document these all experiences? Somehow integrated into a broader, maybe, theoretical view that exists, because it sounds like there's immense knowledge, that needs to be, archived, that needs to be kept for future studies or even implementation as well.
I mean, I think some organizations have been very good, such as NUP, in terms of, particularly as it relates to peace support operations on the ground. They often come to missions and speak with leadership, with tactical leaders, and do that constant engagement. What I think will be very important is that, look, we need to be able to provide a space for both policymakers and academics to be able to sit down and document things. But it needs to be structured, and it has to be in a way that policymakers see value in this process, right? And I think it also goes to the heart of something I saw while I was at the AU, which is that you have a lot of information in people's heads, people who've been working on, let's say, Amazon for 10, 20 years. And then let's say they retire or they leave. And all that intangible knowledge and information is kind of lost. So I think, researchers can translate all of this knowledge and experience into theoretical frameworks, recommendations, etc. But policymakers need to be able to see value in it, and it also needs to happen in a structured way, I think.
So, I mean, in your view, from your career beginning, with Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and where we are now, what has been its most, single success, and what has been its most single challenge that will continue in the near future as well?
I mean, I think I'll start with the challenge, and I think it's that even as we approach the 25th anniversary in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, while we've done a lot on the policy and legislative level, I mean, if we look at the lived experiences of women and girls, we haven't made the kind of progress we should have made in 25 years of investment. So that's the challenge, and it's being able to do that amidst the kind of resourcing crisis that we have, the rights pushback that we have, kind of the global political dynamics that we have currently. So it's that this agenda that started, I feel, with a lot of hope, is basically at a crossroads in terms of both ownership and being able to inspire the next generation of people to work on it amidst what are very difficult circumstances. In terms of what I would say is maybe what I feel I've achieved, or we've collectively achieved on women, peace and security, is that it's kind of become embedded in whether it's being resourced or not, it's kind of been embedded in how we understand. It's become a framework for how we understand peace and security. And I think it's also inspired some forward-looking approaches on youth peace and security. And I think the Women, Peace and Security agenda to a large extent has inspired the youth peace and security agenda and where it shouldn't go as well as where it could go. So it's become embedded in the work that we do. And I think it's here to stay, but it does require some revival and being able to be a bit forward-looking given the challenges we are faced with.
Yeah. So normally in your workspace, what does a good day of work look like and what does, like a bad day of work look like? I know you work in a very stressful environment, so what does it look like for you?
A good day is two things. I think when I've been able to engage directly with someone that's impacted by the work, and it could be a CSO, it could be a woman on the ground, so you're getting some positive feedback. But it's also when you've been able to push something that's taken a long time to come to fruition. Because a lot of the work that we do is very process heavy. And also requires a lot of negotiation and coalition building. So I think, so when you get the positive feedback from the ground, and then also institutionally when you're able to push something, that's what a good day looks like. A bad day is probably when nothing seems to be moving. Can
you imagine? So maybe on a last note and on a more contemporary discussion, I know you're engaged with the Sudan process, which is very important to all of us as well. Why don't you say, a bit as to what's happening in Sudan with regards to, women, both, who are impacted, who are also impacting at the same time, and, what have been the gaps and the learnings that, other African countries can take.
Yeah. So, I mean, my engagement with Sudan is... so in a sense, I started in 2005 and then left after a year or two and then have come back to it. And I think one of the biggest concerns or learnings that I think we've had is that the failure to address accountability and impunity in the early 2000s is what we're seeing has enabled the scale of sexual violence and conflict and human rights violations currently. So I think for me, one key lesson is that this issue of justice and accountability is part and parcel of peace. We used to have a lot of arguments back in the day about, is it justice first, is it peace first? Yeah. But I think if Sudan shows us anything, it's that justice and accountability. And that has to be justice and accountability that's defined by the people. I think there was a ICC process for Darfur, and there's been a lot of frustration about how long the process has taken. So I think what Sudan also highlights is the need for us to think more broadly about justice and accountability. Criminal accountability is important, but there are also other means for accountability and justice, and that needs to be defined by the communities that have been affected. That's one. The second is the importance of localization, right? What Sudan has shown us is that when the international community is forced to leave, when Sudanese are forced to leave, there is still the vanguard of people on the ground, communities who are doing social cohesion work, who are doing humanitarian work. So I think and who are able to quickly pivot and be innovative, right, in terms of how they crowdsource funds. So for me, this issue of accountability and justice and localization for Sudan are very important. Of course, currently we now have a roadmap that's been set out, which hasn't been accepted by the warring parties. There are a lot of concerns about external support for the warring parties. And so unless we fix that issue of external support, it's unlikely that the warring parties will be forced to stop. We've also seen in Sudan, I think, a number of civilian coalitions that are pushing for peace, and there have been concerns about, there are too many groups, etc. But I think what's important to note is that there's consensus on one thing, and that you need a civilian-led government, you need a new Sudan, and you need the transition that was started in 2018 to find its natural end, because it was kind of a paused transition, right? And the people, the Sudanese civilians who fought for that transition, and people still in Sudan fighting for the transition and for a peaceful and new Sudan. I think there's a new impetus for that currently. And so it's to say that there's obviously a political level in terms of what's happening, but my hope is in the people and what they've been able to achieve despite many challenges.
Yeah, I think, it's like you said, it's very important to pay attention to, like the internal process and the localization. And somehow I do see important mechanisms to hold, various stakeholders accountable. I think locally on a national level, how do we implement that on an international level, on the roles external actors play in these situations?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been a recurring theme in a lot of conflicts on the continent. And I think there's a role for the AU, there's a role for individual member states to be able to address what is a very difficult issue. So it's not just that external actors are supporting warring parties. It could also be that external parties are leading on peace processes on the continent. So there's a lack. So in the case of DRC, it was led by the US and also facilitated by Qatar. And you saw an absence of the AU and ECAS and regional organizations. So I think, it's from both sides. It's both on the peacemaking side, but also in terms of the spoiler side, right? That we're dealing with this issue of external actors. And that's one of the biggest issues for policymakers right now, to grapple with how conflicts are changing.
I think in a way we've come very far in terms of 25 years, but the next 25 years I think will look very different in terms of how peace building, mediation and negotiation is going to look like on the continent. And like you said, I think national ownership is very important. Civilian-led processes are quite important. Even to think of, like for sustainability, I think national ownership is very key. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dalaya, for having me.
Samiha. This has been a very important conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank you on behalf of EWNET and our members. And
can I take this?
I know. And we look forward to hopefully having you in the future in our various platforms.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.